Hey, CityCast listeners, it's Megan. If you've been to the Strip, gosh, in the last 10 years, you know a lot has changed. And in a lot of ways, the anchor to all that is the Strip District Terminal. The historic 5-block building used to be the source for all the produce in Pittsburgh. And now it's an all-day destination for shopping, dining, working out, and more. There's the market on Saturdays, performances on Sundays, parking and retail discounts on Tuesdays. Check it all out for yourself in person and at stripdistrictterminal.com. Today on CityCast Pittsburgh, for a lot of people, cars are an essential part of establishing freedom to go where you want, when you want, and if it fits your style, to get there safely encased in bold colors and gleaming metal and chrome. But for millions of Black folks in the first half of the 20th century, cars were about a whole lot more than flash. 2 new exhibits in town dig into that history, and Next Pittsburgh columnist Tony Norman is here to preview them both. It's Monday, June 12th. I'm Megan Harris, and here's what Pittsburgh's talking about.
I remember when my grandmother got her first car. It was a big old, 1970, 72 Cadillac or something. And at that point, she was just so, she was a short woman, but she was so ecstatic about having a car that was so much bigger than her.
Petite ladies love a big car.
Yeah, it symbolized the protection she felt she needed when she was driving around. She wouldn't even use the seatbelt. She considered that whole thing like a plot, to constrain the freedom of Black folks to get around as fast as they needed to. Ralph Nader, I'm not gonna do anything that he wants me to do. I'm gonna hold on to this freedom, of driving around without a seatbelt, but in this big old car that's 100 times bigger than me. So, yeah.
I feel like you've jumped us into the Frick Museum in Point Breeze. Their exhibit is focused on the Great Migration. And I know you wrote about that. Tony, I was floored to see that there were folks in your tour group who did not know much about why people bought these fancy cars.
Right. Yeah, a lot of folks just, and a lot of white folks just assume that, Black people, they get a little bit of money. The first thing you know, they run out and they buy big old fancy cars. Well, they buy big old fancy cars because, one, they weren't allowed to sort of invest in other things like, clubs, or, they couldn't go to hotels or certain places that were, whites only.
Or even traditional banks and investment strategies.
Put their money in traditional banks or do any of the usual investments that you would do with that. So it was, when you're walking around with pockets full of money, from menial labor, you got to put it somewhere. You got to keep the economy circulating somehow. And so they would buy these cars, which would end up doubling as fortresses. You get in the car, you are able to drive back and forth through the American South, to the north. And of course, you had to have everything that you needed for those travels in the car, everything from the tools to food to porta potties to all of that, because it was, you just couldn't assume you could stop anywhere. If you did stop, you were subject to arrest for loitering or whatever. So it was quite a horror show Black folks had to navigate.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that, like the role of the automobile in this Great Migration that brought, thousands and thousands of folks to Pittsburgh?
Yeah, it was, as a lot of Blacks came from in Pittsburgh in the early 20th century, came here from Alabama and Mississippi and the deep, deep South, lured here pretty much by the steel companies that said, hey, there's employment here. come to Pittsburgh, and we'd love to have you. And of course, many of them were used as strike breakers. Many of them were used to basically do all the most menial labor that people didn't want done.
I was
And
going to ask if those were actually good jobs. I'm sure
yeah,
most things are better than sharecropping, but still.
right, right. And in fact, that was the only thing going for it. It was better than sharecropping, but if you're like the low man on a totem pole, at a steel mill, where you're like literally shoveling out, molten slag, and or you're inhaling all like the worst things you can possibly inhale daily just in doing your job. Well, yeah, I guess it beats being a semi-slave, but not by much. And the money, though better than being a slave, was not much better.
That's a sad way to put it, Tony.
Yeah, yeah. So it was. So the automobile itself became a form of liberation. If you had a car, you invested in it, you kept it going, you knew how to drive it. It was something that was more than just a luxury item. It was a necessity for folks. I mean, just to get around, because public transportation was segregated in many places. I mean, just go down the road. If you needed to get to a hospital that was friendly to Black people, you had to drive there. There weren't any ambulances yet, and so, or there weren't ambulance services that would even remotely deal with Black people.
Until
So
Pittsburgh, of course.
until
And
Pittsburgh
yeah, and
again,
our history with
we
that.
have a historical platform there. So yeah, the car was immensely, and these two exhibits, both at the Heinz and the Frick, at the Heinz, it's a Green Book exhibit.
Right,
The
right.
Green Book was the annual document that Black people used to navigate America, to know where the Negro friendly restaurants and businesses were, the garages.
And I think people forget that Jim Crow laws were on the books until the 1950s and still enforced in some areas until the 1970s and 80s. Um,
Exactly, exactly. Enforced informally. I mean, they may
yeah,
not,
right.
they weren't legal
You couldn't
after,
prosecute, but
you
people
know,
would act on it.
exactly, exactly. But the Green Book, which was this necessary document, which debuted 1936, a Harlem postal, I guess, what do we call them now? Well, mailman is what I call them,
A
but
postal worker, mail
whatever
carrier.
they're called now. Um, in 1936 came up with this idea, because there were just so many. I mean, even in Harlem, way up north, there were places where Black people couldn't be served and so forth in Greater New York. And he first put together this little local guide for New Yorkers. And then he said, "Why don't I just expand it to America?" Which he did, and so Black folks, basically became sort of informal data collectors. Folks will come back, from journeys to the deep South and say, "Hey, there's this restaurant on Route 66 that lets us actually sit inside the establishment to eat. And there's this Black-owned place in Tennessee over here that we should frequent. And this is where all the sort of Black-friendly beaches are and the pools and so forth and so on." And you just start collecting all that material. And this guy, Victor Green, who first compiled this information in 1936, just put out this Green Book, as he called it, because it was named after him. Um, well, until 1967. And so in 1967, there was officially no more need for it, because you couldn't just blatantly discriminate against Black people, try and check into your hotel after that without inviting a federal lawsuit. So,
Yeah.
but as you said, it was sort of informally, Jim Crow informally continued all the way up until the 80s, actually.
Yeah.
But this Heinz History Center show, done in partnership with the Smithsonian, basically brings together the reason why the Green Book was so important to Black America, and why pretty much everyone who had a car had a copy of it.
I've heard you say that your parents owned a green book. Did you realize its significance when you were a little kid?
No, no. I mean, it was there. It was always there on the coffee table. It was bigger than Jet magazine, let's say, but not
No, I know what's on your
not
coffee
as big
table,
as the
Tony.
old ebonies, but it was like a regular sort of magazine size publication. And I mean, the one I remember most was the one that was on our coffee table forever. I'm not sure what year it was, but it was phone numbers were scratched out and new phone numbers were written in it and new addresses for certain establishments. And there were all sorts of notes and scribbles on it about certain places, like don't go there again or whatever. And, they were sort of artifacts of a severely circumscribed life, once upon a time.
It makes sense that they would become a living document in that way,
Yeah.
especially for families.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was right there next to, green, dream books and numbers that people wanted to bet on and various things. And it was an essential part of Black life. I mean, it was right up there, at least, after 1968 with the picture of Dr. Martin Luther King on a mantle, between, JFK and RFK, after 68. And you had your Green Book, which at that point was an artifact. But I think people held on to them for sentimental reasons until, maybe really the late 70s when people started cleaning out again.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I'm a little afraid to ask, do you know how Pittsburgh was represented in the Green Book?
Yes. In fact, that part of the Heinz exhibit has a section devoted to Pittsburgh. And it shows the hotels, most of them along Wiley Avenue. And unfortunately, many of them were destroyed when the lower hill was decimated to make room for the Civic Arena, of course.
Which is still the same spot where PPG Paints
Right.
Arena is and the Penguins play.
Exactly. Exactly. And so Pittsburgh had many places. I mean, Pittsburgh was a mecca, was for Black folks coming north because you had the Hill District, which was basically every institution was Black friendly because it was either Black owned or at least the white owners tolerated the Black customers. And so, yeah, Pittsburgh had plenty of Black hotels, so people on the road could had a place to stay. And yeah, so we were definitely a part of the overground railroad, as they say. So that was good to see in this exhibit. I was very, very proud of how Pittsburgh was represented.
Good. I'm very glad to hear that. And if you want to see a few pieces of that history, I know there's a replica of Gus Greenlee's car, for example. He
Yes.
was an unofficial mayor of that area for a good long while. It's over at the Frick.
Yes, yeah. His car is represented at the Frick Museum, or at least the kind of car he drove, like
Right.
this red car. And I wish I could remember the model of it. But I mean, there's a 1940 Plymouth Road King, at the Heinz Museum, and it's really glorious. So they only have one car opposed to the Frick's like 10 cars.
Yeah, Greenlee had the 1938 Packard 12. I'm looking at your
Yeah,
story, Tony.
yeah, yeah. And just seeing those things is like being transported back in time. And I got chills, traveling from car to car, as a matter of fact, just thinking about, if I had just been born a few decades earlier, this car would just, be a routine thing for me, or this one over here. And it really, really gets you. Because, it's a sign of American apartheid,
Mhm.
in the last century. And there's no other word for it. When you see these cars and you see what their function was, when you see the cars that the Black taxi services, had to use because, yellow cab would not come up to the Hill District or
Yeah.
go to Homewood or whatever. And
And
so,
evidence of that jitney system that popped up for so long is still going on in our city. You go down to that South Side Giant Eagle and it's hopping.
You go to Giant Eagle, and there are folks, elderly folks, who just never got out of the habit of calling a jitney.
And it's more reliable than cabs sometimes, and certainly
Yeah,
cheaper than Uber.
yeah, exactly. You fill the trunk of those cars up with your groceries, and you get in the front seat or get in the back seat if you want to do the driving Miss Daisy thing, and head on back home, for a couple of bucks. Yeah. That's the part of the legacy, and which makes both of these exhibits so enlightening, and I think so necessary, because they sort of connect the eras, as it were, and you begin to understand what in the hell was going on in the 20th century American race relations that made these parallel institutions everywhere so necessary.
Well, Tony, we're very grateful to have your voice and your pen in the modern era.
Well, I'm glad to be here. It's good to be alive, and it's an interesting time to be alive.
No doubt. Tony Norman is a columnist for Next Pittsburgh. We'll drop a link to his article on that Frick exhibit, Pittsburgh and the Great Migration, Black Mobility, and the Automobile, in our show notes. Thank you so much, Tony.
Thanks, Megan. It's been good.
Tony and I mentioned Pittsburgh's role in establishing ambulance services. If you want to learn more about that history, we'll drop you a link to our episode about Freedom House in the show notes as well. A little more news before you go. Starting today, the Fern Hollow Bridge, that would be the new version of the one that fell down last year, it's going to be shut down to finish construction for a month. Closures will include Forbes Avenue to South Dallas and Braddock Avenue. It's all expected to be complete just after the 4th of July. And the Penguins are planning to buy the Hunt Armory ice skating rink in Shadyside. Right now, the Pens run a bunch of their diversity and community programming out of that building, and the city approved an agreement that would allow team ownership to buy it for $2 million. That building that the rink's in is more than 100 years old, and the Hunt in its name is a reference to Alfred E. Hunt, who's probably best known, at least around here, for founding the company that we now call Alcoa. That company is still headquartered here, and it's still one of the world's largest producers and distributors of aluminum. The more you know. That's all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. If you're liking the show, please tell a friend, rate us, leave us a review, and make sure you're subscribed to that Hey Pittsburgh newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye. I'm telling you, the tinier the granny, the bigger the car.